before last, this came through my door. You have a choice. Betray your parents to the authorities, or believe in Jesus and put your life in danger. It's a story from North Korea, the most dangerous place in the world to be a Christian. The parents kept their faith secret from their daughter. They knew that if she found their Bible, she'd be under pressure to report them. And if she did, they'd be sent to a labor camp. So for years they prayed secretly in whispers under the blankets, hoping that only God would hear. The daughter writes, "My father prayed for more than 5 years before God gave him the opportunity to share the gospel with me." So what did she do? She chose to listen to her father, and she now believes in Jesus and follows him. The choices we make don't really threaten our lives in this country. Most of our choices don't put our lives in danger, but some choices we make are more important than others. There's been some very important choices made here this morning. Gareth and Sarah, you chose to bring Lewis to be christened, to be presented to God's family, and to take the first step of belonging to Jesus. Godparents, you chose to promise to help Gareth and Sarah to nurture Lewis in the Christian faith. And as a congregation, we chose to promise to worship and work together in such a way as to encourage the family to grow in love and knowledge of God. No one has forced us to make that choice. It's something we have done freely. Well, as I was preparing this sermon, it seemed to me that my Bible readings were challenging me about the choices I make. The choice to go God's way or to go my own way. There are times when self wants to go its own way, and God's will says something else. And sometimes it is a struggle. But my Bible readings were in Genesis. And first I read of Adam and Eve making a wrong choice. Now there's an incentive to make a right choice. They chose to disobey God. Listening to the snake or the devil might be attractive, but it doesn't help in encouraging us to choose God. And as a result of their disobedience, they were thrown out of the garden. They're thrown away from easy living and having to work hard for their food and comfort. A few pages later on, there's Noah. God tells him to build a boat in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the sea. No doubt he was laughed at by his neighbours, but he chose to obey God. And so he is kept safe in the flood, along with all the animals God sent his way. Then Abraham has a choice. To obey God, to move out of the comfortable city, and move into a nomadic existence towards an unknown land. Or he could stay put. But he goes at God's command and believes the promise that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. The choices continue in the New Testament. The disciples whom Jesus called to follow him had a choice. He didn't force them to leave their fishing or their tax collecting. But they decided for themselves to follow him. They often didn't understand Jesus, but it speaks volumes that such a diverse collection of 12 men with differing views and characters, they all chose to be with Jesus. They felt he was worth it. He was more important than their boats, their tax profits, their nationalism, their prejudice. All through the Bible, we have stories of those who find that it is worth choosing to follow God. Part of Moses' speech that we heard read earlier gives the children of Israel a choice, gives us a choice too. He sets before them on the one hand life and prosperity, and on the other hand death and destruction. Life comes from loving God and obeying him. Death comes from disobedience. It's a challenge to us. Moses says, "Now choose life, that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life." It's many years ago now since I decided to follow Jesus 100% of the time. There have been many more choices I've had to make along the way, and it hasn't always been easy, but it has been worth it. I've not always managed to make the right choices. I've failed at times, and even in my 70s I still make mistakes. But through the ups and downs of life, I know that I am forgiven, and I know that I am loved with a love that is far greater than any human love. I've experienced his special peace in the saddest times of my life. He's given me a purpose and a wonderful hope that, in the words of John Wesley, the best is yet to be. Why do I keep choosing to follow Jesus? Because he's worth it. Why do the people of North Korea choose to follow Jesus in such dangerous and difficult situations? But their answer is the same. Jesus is worth it. Our New Testament reading is actually part of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, but it's maybe not a part we concentrate on very much because it's challenging in itself. Jesus really gets down to brass tacks, to what it's all about following Jesus. He goes back to the original 10 Commandments. The Pharisees and the scribes have added many other commandments onto the original 10, and Jesus goes back to their real meaning. Do not murder. In a way that shocked the Jews, me, and maybe you too. He shows us that it's not enough merely to keep a commandment. Do not murder. But our private thoughts matter too. I haven't killed anyone, but there are times when I've wished one or two people might get their comeuppance. Jesus says we are guilty of breaking them if we harbour angry thoughts towards someone in our hearts. My Bible translates, if you call somebody a fool, raka. And raka is an Aramaic swear word meaning a blockhead. I don't know how often you call somebody a fool or a blockhead or perhaps a derogatory term, but We are not, Jesus says, we're not to write off other human beings because of how they look, what they believe, how they act, or the customs they choose to follow. Michael Green sums up Jesus' teaching. He says, it's no good supposing God will be pleased with our worship if our heart is full of bitterness to another. Acceptable worship means repairing relationships. And another challenge Jesus gives us, do not commit adultery. But, he says, it's not enough just to not commit adultery. We have to get our mind, our attitudes right. If we just look lustfully, says the Bible, at another woman, we have committed adultery in our hearts. It's not just the act, but also the attitude that leads to the act. If we watch pornography or read erotic books or magazines that encourages lust, we are breaking God's law. We may have some serious thinking to do about the choices we make. Choosing to follow Jesus isn't easy, whether it's from outward persecution, such as in North Korea, or inward attacks from Satan in our own life. But we are not to be discouraged, because Jesus has defeated Satan on the cross. The ultimate victory belongs to him and to those who follow him. It's amazing when you start planning a sermon and you're thinking about the theme. It's amazing how many things sort of jump out and hit you. I was reading my Christianity magazine for February, it's this month, and I got to the very last page, and there's the big headlines on the last page, choosing well. I think we've got a slide of it, Tim. No? Yeah. Choosing well. And there's the little signpost there with decisions on it. It's Jeff Lucas's page, and he tells the story of Auschwitz prisoner 5239, who was on the so-called Death March in 1945. Without warning, there came a moment on that march when he was out of sight of the guards. And he had a split-second decision to make. He chose well. He nudged a friend and they ran for it and weren't noticed. It was a good decision. And much later, writes Jeff, that escapee made another epic choice. After decades of ignoring God, angry at the horrors he'd seen and felt, he chose to follow Christ, the great liberator. And Jeff knows that story because prisoner 5239 was his dad. I don't know where you are in your Christian life, whether or not you've made the choice to follow Jesus. If you haven't, Deuteronomy encourages you today to choose life. For those of us who have made the choice to follow Jesus, we're faced with choices every day to keep our minds, our thoughts, as well as our actions in the will of God. May God bless us, guide us, and encourage us in all the choices we make. Amen.